Right now, on April 17th, 2026, the US-Iran ceasefire is set to expire by April 22nd, within days, and there is still no agreement in sight. Here is what makes today different from any previous escalation point in this conflict. Every diplomatic tool Washington had has now been used. The guns went quiet on April 8th. Trump called it a historic day for world peace. Markets surged. And then Israel bombed the heart of Beirut. Not a military installation, not a suburb, the center of Beirut, within hours of the ceasefire announcement. That set the tone for everything. That is what this truce has looked like from the very first day. A pause in name, a war in practice. And right now, it is almost out of time. Let me walk you through the exact sequence of events, because the timeline tells you everything about why Washington is now effectively out of moves. On April 8th, Pakistan brokered a 2-week pause between the US and Iran. Tehran agreed to allow shipping to resume through the Strait of Hormuz. Then Netanyahu said, on camera, within hours of the announcement, that Lebanon was not included in the deal. Pakistan's PM said it was. The White House said it wasn't. 3 different versions of the same agreement. On day 1. That is not a ceasefire. That is a dispute wearing a ceasefire's clothes. By April 9th, maritime tracking firm Lloyd's List confirmed only 3 ships had moved through the strait since the truce began. It was still effectively closed. The Abu Dhabi National Oil Company's CEO said publicly that the strait was not open. Around 230 loaded oil tankers sat idle inside the Persian Gulf, going nowhere. Then came Islamabad. On April 11th, Vice President J.D. Vance flew nearly 17 hours to Pakistan, alongside Special Envoys Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner. It was the highest-level direct engagement between the United States and Iran since the 1979 revolution. The world was watching it like a turning point. Iran sent Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi and Parliament Speaker Mohammad Bagher Ghalibaf. Pakistan deployed over 10,000 security personnel around the venue. 21 hours of negotiations, 3 rounds, direct, face-to-face talks. And on April 12th, Vance walked out with nothing. No deal. Nothing signed. His words at the press conference were direct. They have chosen not to accept our terms. He boarded Air Force Two and flew home without an agreement. Iran's Foreign Minister Araghchi used 3 words to describe what happened inside those 21 hours. Maximalism, shifting goalposts, and blockade. A U.S. official told Time that Iran refused to end uranium enrichment, dismantle its facilities, remove its enriched stockpiles, and open the strait without tolls. In other words, Washington walked in demanding total strategic capitulation. Tehran said no. The talks were over before the sun came up in Islamabad. Within hours of the collapse, Trump announced a naval blockade targeting all ships entering or leaving Iranian ports on the Arabian Gulf and Gulf of Oman. CENTCOM clarified that vessels going to Saudi Arabia, Qatar, or the UAE would remain free to pass. Only ships bound for Iranian ports would be stopped. By April 13th, the U.S. military declared the blockade fully implemented and said it had already turned back 10 ships. Iran immediately issued a counter-threat. Tehran warned it would block all shipping across the Persian Gulf, the Sea of Oman, and the Red Sea if the U.S. naval operation continued to expand. The IRGC stated that any military vessel approaching the strait would be met with a severe and decisive response. That warning remains active today. So here's exactly where things stand on April 17th. The ceasefire expires by April 22nd. No extension has been agreed. No new talks are officially scheduled. The Strait of Hormuz is still not fully open. A U.S. naval blockade is active. Both sides are accusing each other of bad faith. The clock is running. In my view, this did not spiral out of control by accident. This is what happens when one side enters a negotiation demanding unconditional surrender, and when a third party, in this case Israel, holds an effective veto over the outcome without ever sitting at the negotiating table. That has not changed. The question today is not whether this ceasefire survives to its expiry date. The real question is what the world looks like the morning after it does not. Today, I want to show you why the Islamabad talks were structurally set up to fail, what the blockade can realistically accomplish, and who benefits from this chaos. If this is the kind of analysis you want, past the press releases and into the real mechanics of how power moves, hit the like button right now. Drop a comment below and tell me, do you think a second round of talks in Islamabad can change anything? Or is this conflict already past diplomacy? Let's get into it. The most revealing moment of the Islamabad talks happened before a single word was spoken between the delegations on April 11th. Iran's delegation flew to Pakistan on a Pakistani Air Force escort. JF-17 fighters, AWACS surveillance aircraft, transponders switched off. Think about what that image actually tells you. A country under active military blockade, flying its negotiators to peace talks under fighter escort. That is not the posture of a side that has capitulated. That is the posture of a side that believes it is still fully in the fight. Inside the Serena Hotel, the U.S. opened with a demand for a 20-year moratorium on uranium enrichment. Iran countered with 5 years. Washington said no. That gap, 20 years versus 5 years, is what the press reported as the central breakdown. But the gap itself was not the real story. Neither position was new. Washington had been pushing for zero enrichment since March. Iran had insisted on its sovereign enrichment rights for decades. So the real question is not why the talks failed. The real question is why Washington arrived with demands it already knew Iran could not accept. In my view, the answer has 2 layers. The first involves Israel. Netanyahu went on camera during the talks to say his campaign against Iran is not over, not after the talks, during them. While Vance negotiated inside the hotel, Israel's prime minister was publicly undermining the process on live television. The second layer is more structural. The U.S. demand to end all enrichment is about capability, not just weapons. And capability cannot be bombed away. Nuclear expertise does not disappear when centrifuges are destroyed. The knowledge exists inside thousands of Iranian scientists and engineers. It is irreversible. Centrifuges can be dismantled. Sanctions can be lifted in stages. But what Washington is demanding, a permanent end to Iran's breakout potential, cannot be given back once conceded. Tehran and Washington both understand that, which means the demand was never really about reaching a deal. It was about creating a documented failure. A failure that Washington could point to when the ceasefire expires. Proof, for a domestic audience, that Iran chose nuclear weapons over peace. Iran's parliament speaker Ghalibaf said afterward that the U.S. failed to gain his delegation's trust. In diplomatic language, that means the preconditions made a deal impossible. Arachi added another detail the press largely ignored. His side said the 2 sides came close on the strait, then hit a wall over the U.S. demand for joint administration of the waterway. Iran rejected that immediately. Tehran's position has always been consistent. The strait runs through Iranian and Omani territorial waters, and those 2 countries manage it, not Washington. Meanwhile, outside the hotel, 40 world leaders were on a UK-France virtual summit discussing how to reopen the strait without the United States. 40 countries. A parallel track. America was not leading that summit. America was the subject of it. That shift in diplomatic gravity is one of the most significant developments of this entire conflict. The CFR's James Lindsay noted that Vance's language after the talks, "They have not chosen to accept our terms," sounds like someone who came expecting surrender, not negotiation. What this suggests is that Islamabad was designed to produce a documented failure, not a deal. The next question is what Washington does with that failure before April 22nd arrives. Here is something Trump said on Fox News on April 13th. He was asked whether gas prices would come down before the midterm elections. His answer, "It could be the same, or maybe a little bit higher." That one sentence is the most honest thing anyone in Washington has said in weeks. Gas in the United States is now averaging $4.12 a gallon, according to AAA. That is nearly 14% higher than when the war began in late February. The $4 threshold matters. A March AAA survey found that 59% of Americans said they would change their driving or lifestyle when gas crossed that level. That is not abstract. That is families cutting road trips, small businesses adjusting delivery routes, and voters noticing a number every time they fill up their tank. University of Michigan consumer sentiment just hit 47.6, the lowest score in the survey's entire recorded history. Not since 2008, not since COVID, the lowest ever. Inflation expectations jumped to 4.8% for the coming year. The CPI rose 0.9% in March alone, pushing the annual rate to 3.3% above the Fed's 2% target. The war has now cost an estimated $25 billion through late March, with ongoing costs running around $500 million per day, according to the Center for American Progress. Now add the blockade. It went into effect April 13th. It directly cuts off Iran's oil exports, but it also keeps the strait in military tension. No commercial shipper wants to enter. Before the war, roughly 20% of global oil and gas passed through the Strait of Hormuz. With the closure, Brent crude surged. Oil was still near $110 a barrel in early April. Even the optimistic scenario looks expensive. Analysts project Brent crude settling around $80 by end of 2026, still 10% above pre-war levels if everything goes right from here. So Trump told American voters on Fox News that the pain is not going away before November. Republicans hold the House by a narrow margin. This is the political terrain of the blockade. Gas above $4 is one of the most historically reliable predictors of incumbent party losses in midterm elections. The president knows this. Every Republican in a competitive seat knows this. Here is the structural contradiction. The blockade is supposed to pressure Iran back to the table, but it also keeps oil elevated. The pressure tool is also the self-inflicted wound. Russia has watched all of this with considerable satisfaction. In Q1 2026, 90% of Russia's crude exports went to China and India. Moscow condemned the blockade and cashed the revenues. China's position is more consequential. Beijing called the blockade dangerous and irresponsible. Its foreign ministry demanded a full ceasefire. And then a Chinese-linked tanker probed the line. The vessel was the MV Rich Starry, Chinese-owned, flying a Malawian flag, transponder spoofed for 11 days. It carried roughly 250,000 barrels of methanol, almost certainly originating from Iran. According to the Jerusalem Post, the Rich Starry eventually slipped through the blockade. No U.S. vessel boarded it. No vessel fired on it. It passed. And that one tanker tells the whole story, because it answers the central operational question about this blockade. When a Chinese-linked ship approaches the line, what does the U.S. Navy actually do? The answer so far is nothing definitive. China holds 1.3 billion barrels in strategic reserves, roughly 120 days of supply. Beijing can survive without Iranian crude for months. The question is whether Washington can afford to find out. So let me show you the full pattern. Because when you look at everything from February 28th to April 17th, one pattern becomes impossible to ignore. The war began when the US and Israel struck Iran on February 28th. Iran responded by closing the Strait of Hormuz. Russia's revenues doubled. China rerouted. Washington tried military strikes. The strait stayed closed. It tried economic ultimatums. The strait stayed closed. It brokered a ceasefire. Still closed. It sent the vice president to the highest level talks since 1979. Talks collapsed. It announced a blockade. The strait remains not fully open. The pattern holds. Each escalation has produced the same structural result. Iran stays in the fight, the strait stays contested, and the economic cost to the United States keeps rising. That is not bad luck. That is what happens when a strategy designed for a different era runs into a country that has spent 47 years building tolerance for exactly this pressure. Here is what I think is happening beneath the surface. Iran is not trying to win militarily. It is trying to outlast the political calendar, and the calendar is on Tehran's side. The ceasefire expires around April 22nd. The midterms are in November. Iran's calculation appears to be that Washington needs a deal more urgently than Tehran does right now. Iran's economy is under real stress. The rial has lost 15% in a month. Oil revenues are being cut by the blockade. The IMF pegs the fiscal break-even at over $120 per barrel. But Iran has institutional memory for enduring economic pain that Washington does not. Sanctions have been a constant since 1979. Survival under pressure is a core state competency. The U.S., by contrast, is running $500 million a day in military costs, while gas prices push toward the threshold that historically triggers midterm voter backlash. Consumer sentiment is at an all-time record low. Inflation is re-accelerating. And Trump has now said on Fox News that prices may not come down before November. That is why Pakistan's PM is touring Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and Turkey this week. That is why 40 world leaders held a virtual summit today to discuss reopening the strait independently. America is not leading that diplomatic summit. America is the subject of it. That is a significant shift from where Washington expected to be 7 weeks into this war. What happens next depends on a few key variables. Whether the ceasefire gets extended before April 22nd, whether a second round of Islamabad talks happens before that window closes, and whether the blockade changes Tehran's calculations, or simply accelerates a China-Russia-Iran corridor that operates entirely outside the dollar-based financial system. In my view, the most likely near-term scenario is a ceasefire extension. Both sides have reasons to buy more time. But an extension is not a resolution. It is a pause. And every pause in this conflict has ended with the same problems intact. Iran's enrichment program, the Strait, Lebanon, and what regional order follows from this war. The deeper issue is whether the framework that governed American power in the Middle East since 1945, pressure, ultimatum, capitulate, still produces results. The evidence says no. When a country of 90 million people, under sanctions for nearly 5 decades, holds the world's most powerful navy at a 7-week stalemate, that is data about where power sits in 2026. I'm not saying Iran is winning. I am saying the old playbook is no longer producing the outcomes it was designed to produce. That gap between the tool and the result is the real story. The most dangerous moment in any conflict is not when a new strategy is chosen. It is the moment just before, when leaders insist the old approach just needs a little more time. That is where we are on April 17, 2026. Ceasefire expiring. No deal. No scheduled talks. A blockade already probed, without consequence, by a Chinese-linked tanker. That is my analysis. If this kind of deep dive is what you come here for, hit like and subscribe. Drop a comment. What do you think happens after April 22nd? I read every one.